Okay.
So good morning, everyone. We are really happy to welcome you to the second September lecture in the joint series on decline, sponsored by the University of California, San Diego and the Universidad de Firenze. I am very excited because now we are moving through the second phase, and the lectures will, of course, continue all the way through next January. So I want to turn over to my colleague, Denise Dimitriou, who will introduce our speaker today.
And hi, everyone, and welcome from me as well. Our speaker today, before I introduce her, I want to mention that she's asked that when we get to the question and answer session at the end of the talk, that you actually type your questions in the chat box. So I'll remind everyone of this at the end as well, but I'm mentioning it now so that you can type away while she's giving her talk. It's a true pleasure for me to introduce Stefania De Vido, our speaker today, who is an associate professor of ancient Greek history at the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. But today she's actually speaking from Taranto, where she is for a conference, and then really on a whole tour that includes various places in Sicily. And that's really quite appropriate since she's really made quite a mark in the history of the island with her many publications on so many different aspects that really include the Elimians, the political history of the island, political constitutions of the island, the various Sicilian tyrants, interethnic relations among these, the people who inhabited the island of Sicily. And really, like, from these Sicilian sort of explorations, she extrapolates and speaks more broadly about ancient Greek history and ancient Greek historiography. I also want to mention that she's done a great service to the field, really an invaluable service with her participation and management of the Axon database, which offers a selection of Greek historical inscriptions with commentaries. And it's really a great database for those of you in the audience who may not know about this. It also is accompanied by a journal called Axon. It's an online journal that she directs. So I think that given what I've just said about the great many, I guess, publications on Sicily, it's really impressive that her talk today is going to be on Athens, the radical democracy of Athens. And I think, you know, all of us who claim that we're Greek historians teach a lot about Athens, but very few of us actually publish on Athens, and Stefania De Vido has also published on Athens. So I think I give this as an example of the breadth, her range. So please join me in welcoming Professor De Vido, and I will see you again all at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I would like to thank my colleagues at the universities of San Diego and Florence for involving me in this stimulating series devoted to decline. The topic I chose, I think, is of great concern to citizens of the Western world, as well as scholars of the classical world. We recognize the exceptional nature of 5th century Athenian democracy, and in particular of the phase following the reform of the Ephialtes that we call radical democracy. It's one of the most famous and most interesting chapters in the history of ancient world, a kind of giant in the study of history. Here I want to dwell only some aspect and start with an important question. When we talk about the decline and fall of radical democracy, what are we really talking about? What declines? Which falls? In this paper, we will be guided by the sources, by the historians of the 5th century. So, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I have a problem. It doesn't work. So, okay. Let us begin with a day late winter 430. In Athens, there is a funeral ceremony in honor of the fallen of the first year of the war, conducted according to traditional use, Patrios Nomos, which also includes athletic and musical competitions. The ceremony takes place outside the door of the Ipilon in the former Portus Quarter, which later became a cemetery. Thucydides Stefani is at the most beautiful quarter outside the doors of the city. Even today, it's a green and beautiful place, quiet in the heart of the modern city, and crossed by small waterway, the Eridanus, on the way to Academy and Eleusis. As Thucydides says, the ceremony is as follows. The bones of the dead are exposed in a special tent erected for that occasion, and after 3 days, the funeral coffins are carried in the processions. The Patrias Nomos, the burial takes place in a space dedicated only of the fallen in the war, that's called the Mausoleum Sema. And when the remains have been led away in the heart, a man chosen by the city, esteemed for his intellectual gifts and excellent for prestige, delivers over them an appropriate eulogy. In 430, Pericles is chosen to speak. He pronounces an impressive, powerful, vital speech. We call it epitaph, speech on the tomb, but it's actually a speech full of light and life. It outlines an image of Athens remaining forever, a real thema essay. It's also a necessary reference for us to think about and to understand Athenian democracy. Thanks to his formidable oratory, Pericles knew how to create a special relationship with the Athenian demos. This is well illustrated by the beautiful page that the historian dedicates to him in his work. And so Athens, though we name a democracy, logo, gradually became in fact, ergo, a government ruled by the foremost citizen. We will return to this portrait. Here, it's important to emphasize Pericles' ability to create with his word and this charisma a special bond with the listeners, not only the citizens of the political assembly, but also the men and women who attend the state funerals. On this occasion, he demonstrates that the violent death of the young Athenians have a higher value for the collective good, and that by the sacrifice of their bodies, they have gained immortal kleos. And finally, he hastily dismisses children, wives, and parents of the fallen. In this way, the ceremony ends in hopeful atmosphere, and we too conclude with this mood our reading of this page, with apparently and thus. Such were the funeral ceremonies that took place during the winter, the close of which brought the first year of this war to an end. But instead, we should continue reading, because at this point, Thucydides inserts one of his brilliant strokes with a very strong rhetorical impact. Immediately after the conclusion of the story of the burial, it continues with a brief reference to the second Lacedaemonian invasion of the Attic territory, and then with a dramatic announcement. And before they had been many days in Attica, the plague began for the first time to show itself among the Athenians. After the speech for the dead, the plague. After the light of the epitaph, the shadow of disease. Reading the story of the plague in Athens has current resonances that we would never have imagined. But beyond these echoes, it is interesting to insist on the contrast between these two parts of the stories. The speech and the account of the plague are very famous, but they are often read separately and rarely compared directly. In the work of Thucydides, they are one after the other in strict continuity. I believe that this proximity is intentional and solicits some reflections that concern our topic. The disorder of the plague becomes particularly evident when compared with the orderly and composed ceremony that Thucydides has just described. In other cities, for example in Sparta, also for practical and sanitary reasons, the bodies of the soldiers are cremated altogether on the battlefield, and their remains, ashes and bones, are buried in mounds erected on the ground of the battle. At home, memory may be preserved in individual cenotaphs. In Laconia, for example, the graves or the empty graves of individual soldiers are marked by very poor steles, where the name of the dead is preserved only by virtue of death in battle and polemic. As we have seen, Athens adopts a different custom every year, even before the Peloponnesian War, in late winter, when all war activity is suspended. All the fallen are buried in the Mosion Sema according to Patrus Nomos, the traditional rite. These nomos and this order are completely subverted in the period of the plague, and the customs which they had observed regarding burial were all thrown into confusion, and they buried their dead, each one as he could. This subversion does not concern only the world of the dead or religious tradition, but it overwhelms the entire value system on which democracy is founded. The moment of burial in the Patrus Nomos contains, in fact, a political, ideological, and symbolic message. Also on this occasion, democracy knows how to combine the past and innovation. In an ingenious way, it does not deny tradition, but incorporates them and gives them a new meaning. The bones of the dead remain exposed in a tent erected for this purpose 3 days ahead. Each citizen brings to his fallen family member the offering. And then, during the burial, anyone who wishes to participate, citizen or foreigner, participates. In front of the place, the women, relatives of the fallen, gather for the ritual lament. The lament of the women had an important place in traditional and aristocratic ceremonies. The large geometric vases found in the Kerameikos represent the ekphora, the display of the corpse, reserved for high-ranking personages. In them, we see desperate women with tear their hair and stage the funeral mourning. In the Patrus Nomos, this grief is not denied, but completely transfigured. It does not accompany the ceremonies of the aristocrats. It does not celebrate monuments and mounds erected in the manner of Helios, but becomes part of a representation made and designed for the old demos. At the moment of this funeral procession, carts appear with several cypress coffins, one for each tribe. There rest the remains of those who belonged to the tribe. After the transport, the cypress boxes are buried and remain completely invisible. The fallen in war have no monuments or statues, but only their names written on large lists while exposed in the cemetery space along the way to the academy. The funerary landscape of the Demosion Sema is dominated by this list. One of the most famous examples you see in the slide is the list of the fallen of the Erecthaid tribe, today preserved in the Louvre and dated 459. These lists are most or less large, present sometimes as celebratory composition, and were always organized by the same criterion, one list for each tribe. These documents show the great efficiency of the Athenian institutional mechanism, very punctual in recording every moment of collective life. The highest military magistrates take care of everything. They collect the bodies, proceed to the pyres in the field, bring the bodies back home, and compile the 10 list. The effort in preparing the ceremony has an almost accounting flavor and responds to an attention to numbers, data, and good organization that we see in all 5th century Athenian public epigraphy. The dead are recorded without their father's name, but only by their proper names, and they are grouped not according to family, but according to the tribes to which they belong. Thus, family membership is sacrificed to membership in the collective and egalitarian body of the city. Throughout the ceremony, the roles within the family are reinterpreted in function of collective needs. The young people may have other children who will become citizens. The old people, useless for reproduction, may aspire to honor the only thing that does not age. The children must emulate their fathers, and while waiting for them to become soldiers, the city will take care of them. The celebration of the dead is functional to the survival of the living inside of the Christian system. 10 coffins for 10 tribes. This picture of values is completely subverted by the plague. Pericles had described the Athenians as lovers of knowledge and beauty, philosophumen kai philokalumen, guided by the aesthetics of living, intent on cultivating the spirit above all else. The plague shows men in their inhumanity dictated by despair, in loneliness and fear. In other respects, also the plague first introduced into the city a greater lawlessness. With the plague, all the impressive ideological apparatus that had supported the democracy falters. The disorder in the borders is a sign of a wider disorder, which concerns the structure of the democratic city. In the face of this emergency, it cannot respect the cosmos celebrated by Pericles. I believe that Thucydides has deliberately emphasized the difference between the city of the speech and the city of the plague. In the eyes of the historian, in fact, the plague represents an epochal moment, the end of an equilibrium. During the plague, in fact, Pericles dies, and with him ends a happy period of democracy, which had its own balance point in the special relationship between the exceptional strategos and the people. After the plague and after his death, however, begins the decline. The thesis of Thucydides is very clear on this point, but you see it, but the successors of Pericles were ready to surrender to the people even the conduct of public imperial states. There resulted many blunders, especially the Sicilian expedition. The chapter continues with a summary of all the troubles that awaited the Athenians until 404, with the defeat of Agospotami and the end of the empire. The thesis of the epochal nature of the death of Pericles is also taken up by the Athenian Politeia of the Aristotelian school. However, until Pericles was champion of the people, status to demon, the situation of the government was better, but when Pericles died, it got much worse. This convergence is not surprising, considering the judgment that Thucydides and Aristotle share about the brief experience of the oligarchic government of 411, defined by both as good government. Their political affairs seem to have been run well at this moment, and Thucydides, and this was the first time in my time that the Athenians showed that they governed themselves well, for a moderating mixture of oligarchy and democracy took place. This unity is obviously very far from democracy, but Pericles seems immune to the limiting judgment that instead invests the Athenian experience of the following decades. According to historians, therefore, after the death of Pericles, the city commits a chain of errors. Among them, the most serious is the choice to go to Sicily. At the start of the 6th book, we can read the speeches of Nicias and Alcibiades, the strategoi chosen in 415 to guide the Stolos to Sicily and provided with full powers. In his speech, Nicias tries to convince the Athenians to question the decision to go to Sicily and to act with prudence and reason. In admonishing them, Nicias uses an adverb, neosti, referring to the plague and to the death of Pericles, that literally does not make sense, since more than 10 years have passed since the plague. But it's as if he wanted to cancel the time and the facts occurred in between time. The rise of Cleon, the peace of Nicias, the 421, the Eventus Melos. But Nicias tries to get back there, to Pericles and to his strategy. The city has to use its military and economic capacity according to the perspectives that Pericles had indicated, with a recommendation to take care of the fleet and not to try to open the borders of the empire, not to try to open the borders. Nicias is the figure who gives body and voice to Thucydides' interpretation of Pericles' function within the Athenian experience and of the catastrophe represented by this death. This interpretation allows us to focus on two essential elements of democracy and its decline. The first one is the particular nature of democracy, which in fact was the government of a proto-Saner, and the very close and in some ways necessary link between democratic experience and the growth of the arcade of the empire. What are we talking about then when we talk about radical democracy? We can begin with the formal aspect. It's recognized on the basis of certain institutional indicators that highlight its specificity. In this sense, it's useful to read the Politicos Logos of Herodotus in the third book, the debate between the three Persian nobles who participated in conspiracy against the usurper, the Magoi. The three, Otanes, Megabizos, Darius, argue about what the best form of government of Persia is, and each of the three defends the politeia. It's probable that Herodotus learned of the story of Darius through informants or official accounts, but it remains more problematic to place confidence in the historical reality of the debate reported by him. Indeed, it seemed to reflect an old Greek discussion, and not Persian, about the best of possible governments and anticipated some elements present in more elaborate form in 4th century theory. The tripartition of political forms, the use of the criterion of quantity, one, a few, the majority, and the cyclical representation leading from one other. In this debate, we are especially interested in the voice of Otanes, attentive to prudence and logos. He makes a long historical argument against autocratic power and in favor of democracy. Otanes' speech presents some themes and words, Thonos and Hybris versus Isegorie or Isonomie, typical of the anti-tyrannical tradition of the late archaic age, when we advises the Persian to place power in the middle, the Thenai and to Meso, Herodotus uses an expression attested in other places of his work, and he refers to the circular space already visible in the circle of elders in the Agora, represented on the Homeric Achilles shield. In this type of representation, anti-tyrannical politeiae are not revolutionary or radical. However, Otanes' speech also presents more progressive elements, more in keeping with a modern representation of democracy, with more precise references to democracy of the mid-5th century. Accountability, lottery, and common decisions are not generic, but they photograph in a technical way the innovative elements of Athenian democracy, completely developing only after the Persian Wars, and in particular with the Ephialtes and Pericles. We see on the slide the three elements. At the end of their annual office, the magistrates had to account for their work also from a financial point of view. This practice is well demonstrated by rich epigraphical production that testifies to the great accuracy in recording expenses. Aristotle in the Politica identifies precisely in the lottery the element that distinguishes the democratic regime from any other political form in which election is used instead. In the final sentence, Engarto Pollo Enita Panta, finally, one can already grasp that quantitative logic that guides the entire Aristotelian argumentation on democratic politeia. In Politica, he writes, the just in the democratic sense consists in having equality in relation to number and not to merit. Herodotus also shows that he is fully aware of the contradiction of the democratic context. In defending aristocracy, Megabizos says that nothing is more stupid and arrogant than the people. Darius declares that all wickedness arises when power is in the hand of the people. In this criticism, we recognize the tone of anti-democratic polemic that fears the transition from democracy to demagogy. I don't know how you spell this word, demagogy, and so, and from demagogy to tyranny, and depicts the people as a torrent unable to stop. In his portrait, Herodotus thus moves with a double representation of democracy. The more archaic one, represented above all as an alternative to tyranny, and the more modern and the contemporary one of an accomplished democracy, contemporary to Herodotus. In this way, the historian allows us to understand the sense of the internal evolution of the Athenian democratic polity in process that began with Cleisthenes in 408 and matured with Ephialtes and Pericles. And the representation of the Athenian polity in a series of changes, metabolai, is also found in the first part of the Aristotelian Athenian Politeia. The whole ancient tradition agrees in recognizing the starting point of democracy in the reform of Cleisthenes at the end of the 6th century. We can follow this tradition, especially if you want to privilege the institutional level and a formal and normative notion of democracy. Cleisthenes' choice is not subservice. He, for example, does not propose land redistribution, but inclusive. It goes beyond the closed logic of traditional groups and involves the demos more directly. On the territorial aspect prevails the political aspect. Cleisthenes creates 10 tribes of citizens, each of which has within it citizens of all areas, the city, the interior, the coast, of all social classes, all trades, all political interests. The watchwords are broadened and mixed. The number 10, as we have seen, dictates the rhythm of the public life. The identity of the polites, a free adult male, is marked by the name that indicates membership in a specific demos. The signs of this reform are visible in all the formal expressions of the city, particularly in the decrees. On this stylus, we see Athenian institution at work. In particular, we can recognize the perfect institutional process that leads to the decisions. The boule prepares the agenda, instructs the issues, the assembly of citizens votes. The institutional framework, however, is not distinctive of radical democracy. This ether remains unchanged even in the 4th century, the tribes remaining 10 until the beginning of the Hellenistic age. In other words, I think that the reform for 508 alone is not enough, because Cleisthenes breaks some of the ties but preserves the basic structures of the aristocratic city. The power of the archontes, the ownership structure, a social stratification that excludes the fetae, the citizens who do not have enough income to buy the outlet. Tradition tells us that the crucial year was 461, with the reform of Ephialtes. On the Areopagus, a rocky hill at the foot of the Acropolis, the council of all those who had been archontes met. And since the archontes can belong only to the two highest census classes, it was a council of the aristocratic council. So, it is of those few who had landed property and the possibility of breeding horses. The Areopagus had maintained a great control over the city even after the reform of Cleisthenes. For almost 2 generations, so Athens had been in a well-tempered democracy that pleased the moderates, and that will continue to have its fortune in the 4th century. It was a democracy in balance between the traditional power of the aristocratic class and the new Cleisthenic institution. Ephialtes upset this balance in favor of democratic institutions, boule, ecclesia, elieia. And while the archontes lost power, the prestige of the strategoi consolidated. The strategoi are 10, they are the only magistrates electing, and they can iterate their position. They have prerogatives of military, financial, and foreign policy. Pericles is elected strategos for 15 years in a row, and his power is entirely legitimate. The power of Pericles allows us to reflect on a particular aspect of democracy, which became increasingly accentuated during the 5th century. After Clisthenes, all citizens of whatever status, wealth, and culture were equal in their access to the democratic institution. Apparently, each polites is in the condition of archane and archistyle to command and be commanded in a mechanism of reciprocity and rotation. Clisthenes had emphasized the shared space of the middle, but radical democracy leads to a polarization that progressively empties this space in favor of two extremes. On the one hand, the leading personalities, strategoi, and the other hand, the demos in a very special institutional space, the law courts. Simple individuals stand out on the anonymous and collective structure, and they exercise a role of guarantee, control, and direction. Actually, ancient observers describe democracy through the succession of leading figures, and many criticize the action of demagogues. They put pressure on the assembly through rhetoric, charisma, or perhaps money. So we can understand Thucydides' comment on the relationship between democracy and the power of one man. He gives us some very topical questions about the nature of democracy, about the professionalization of politics, about the necessity of charismatic figures, about the distance between the formal description of a politeia and its concrete implementation. The importance of the demos manifests itself in the Elieia, the college of courts that acquires a progressively increasing power. Anti-democratic thought, in fact, speaks of Athens as the city of courts. To become a judge is enough to be a citizen and have 30 years. The nature of law and the Greek process based on the debate does not require any specific knowledge. The assignment to one court is organized by a complicated draw witnessed by some machine found at Agora. In these best years, Athens can mobilize up to 6,000 citizens. It's a very high number, and it suggests an identification between the body of citizens and the body of judges. In the courts, the demos can fully exercise its control and power without any institutional mediation. We can refer to one of Pericles' most famous decisions. Pericles devised the payment of a pay for judges. This measure reveals that the strength of the welding between the demos and its leaders lies in the most effective means, money. Being a citizen and becoming a judge in the court became a profession. True obols were more or less the pay of a day's work, twice the pay of a miner. The mistos for the judges and then extended to the participants of the council and of the assembly as well is the most interesting and characteristic sign of radical democracy. The mistos make clear the link between the functioning of radical democracy and the Athenian Empire. I just remember that in 424, in the florid of radical democracy, Athens quotes a decree proposed by Tudippos, a man of the circle of Cleon. With the excuse of the expenses to support for the war, he imposes a revision of the tribute and it reaches a very high sum. At the same time, in the same decree, he decides the raising of the mistos for the judges from 2 to 3 oboloi. We are not surprised that Cleon, the protagonist of the double reinforcement, the reinforcement of democracy and the reinforcement of the power, was painted in a negative way by all the moderate part by Thucydides and by Aristophanes. From a formal and the institutional point of view, the beginning of democracy is the reform of Clisthenes. But from the point of view of its radical development, the turning point is the transfer of the Delio-Attic League from Delos to Athens in 454. Created with the aim of defending cities of Asia Minor, the League soon takes on a different profile from a traditional symmachia. Almost all the allies have to contribute not with ships or soldiers, but with a phoros, a monetary tribute collected by special magistrates. Democracy and empire evolve in parallel. While the politeia changed with the reforms of Ephialtes and Pericles, the military alliance increasingly becomes an arche, an exercise of imperialist power. At the middle of the 5th century, important things happen. In 461, the exile of Cimon, the son of Miltiades, represented the so-called democracy of the Areopagus and the reform of Clisthenes. And after a few years, the treasure of the League was moved to Athens, and the sexagesima of the annual tribute, recorded in a special list, was destined in the treasure of Athena. Athens finally becomes the center of the empire system. The glory of Athens, of its democracy, its monuments, and its men rests on the empire, on a new idea of territoriality that overturns the traditional notion of hegemony. The territory of Athens stretched across peninsulas, islands, and the coast of 2 continents, encompassing the sea, ports, cultival plains, mines, trading posts, military colonies, controlling large and small cities. Everything as it has its center in Athens, the thinking head of this living organism. It's a hypertrophic and voracious head, which needs the empire to feed itself and its democracy. It's a simple, a terrible thing. Radical democracy is an imperialist democracy. For this reason, too, Athens is inflexible in the tribute. It limits, in any case, the autonomy of its allies, who are reduced to total military, political, and economic dependence, imposes garrisons and magistrates, directs their foreign policy, centralizes culture and cults, and wants to impose a single cult for Athena and a single currency, the Athenian ore, on everyone. Attempts and rebellion are harshly suppressive. In the dialogue between the Meli and the Athenians at the end of Book 5, the Athenians theorize the necessity of the exercise of force to keep the empire system solid. Force not exercised is useless, it does not exist, and that is why, if necessary, one must be cruel. So we can understand Plutarch's comment. They, in fact, became from allies they were, tributaries and slaves. Athens was split in 2. Outside is a terrible, inflexible Athens that deserves the bad definition of polis tyrannos, and inside, democratic, rich, and happy city depicted by Pericles as the school of Greece, where beauty, wisdom, and happiness are proclaimed as right for the Athenians and offered to the whole world. Citizens have concrete aesthetic, economic benefits. The city sees the mortal beauty of its Acropolis grow, an entire city at work, the experiment of perfection paid for with the empire's money. Athens is man, goods, object, minds, ideas from all the known world circulated in the port of Piraeus. It's a city world as Rome was in the imperial age, or perhaps London in Victoria's time. Silphium hides carpets, ivory, and then money, metals, precious materials, and craftsmen, artists, historiographers, philosophers, and so on. To sum up, service on the triremes, public works, paid political activity, maintenance at public expense of war orphans, guests, winners of the Pan-Hellenic Games, distribution to settlers of land confiscated from rebel cities, a very rich and very large city. All social classes benefit from imperialism, the aristocrats, the middle class, the laborers. Equality between citizens is measured in terms of opportunity. The we of which Pericles speaks includes all citizens who can enjoy the many advantages of their care. This explains, I think, the sensational law on citizenship passed by Pericles himself in 451. It's no longer enough to be the son of a citizen father, one must also have the mother, daughter of an Athenian man. Good citizenship is verified in the dokimasia process, when magistrates are asked about the name or ancestry of the parents. Paradoxically, radical democracy develops under the sign of closure and exclusion. Placener had aimed to enlargement and inclusion. Pericles reverses course in the name of an absolute criterion such as birth. The Athenians recognized themselves in an exclusive form of nobility, a sort of eugenia, Greek, that does not admit negotiation or exceptions. The politeia thus as powerful ideological glue in the myth of autonomy and the rhetoric of excellence. Of all the cities, the most fervent supporters of this democracy and this empire are the Thetae employed on the ships and those who live in town. It's true that all those who live in Attica are Athenians, but the nature of radical democracy, with its drive for active participation, assembly, courts, fleet, processions, and so on, privileges the urban demos, daily involved in all the opportunities offered by the imperialist city. If you take a trip to Attica today, you will understand very well how participation in the 4-monthly ecclesiae or in the colleges of tribunals means traveling long, dusty, and comfortable roads, leaving the camp, losing a day's work, reaching Athens, and coming back. I wonder how many really did this, how widespread awareness there might have been in rural context of the discussion, the decisions to be voted on, the mood of the urban demos. The progressive abandonment of the rural perspective becomes very evident when Pericles, at the beginning of the war, takes a shocking step and invites the Athenians to leave the countryside and the land and to shut themselves up in the great walls. Pericles' choice reveals the attitude of democratic Athens, which invests everything in the urban center, the port, the empire, and the control of the allies. While the urban demos is untouched by this novelty, the rural demos suffers. Just think of the Acarnanians exposed to the invasions of the Lacedaemonians. They would have liked to stay in their homes and defend their fields. They obey Pericles, but wish to return home. Aristophanes gives them a voice in the comedy performed in 425, when the split between the strategy of the radical Democrats and the tradition-bound moderates had become stark. The demos follows his strategos almost blindly, even in the final choice, the war. Precisely while urging him to shut himself up within the walls of Athens, Pericles enumerates the wealth of the city to face the war. You can read it in this passage. When we look at the Acropolis, we immediately think of the celebration of democracy. We need only think of the frieze that runs all around the Parthenon and shows the great procession of the Panathenae rhythmically according to the number 10. But the Acropolis is also something different. With its epigraphic landscape, degrees, counts, list of tributes, it makes clear to all citizens, metoikoi, foreigners, the smooth functioning of democracy and the wealth of the empire. With its monuments, it shows the enormous wealth of the city. The Parthenon, a strange temple without an altar, is also a thesauros, a place to keep the statue of Athena and the inestimable riches gathered thanks to the empire. At this point, the picture is complete. Radical democracy, the democracy of the horsemen and the law courts, empire and war are held together by the same necessity. And Pericles is the intelligent interpreter of this bond. Women and men who listen to him in the Kerameikos can look towards the Acropolis and understand everything in the same glance. Pericles, the monuments, the Demosion Sema. As we have said, and to see this reconstruction to epitaph is closely linked to the plague. And just as a speech manages to link democracy, empire, and work together, the plague marks the beginning of the end of this system. With the plague, Pericles dies, and with him a dream. Then the historian records the rise of Cleon, the many mistakes, the premises for defeating the war, the end of the empire, the crisis of democracy. The disintegration has its premise precisely in Pericles' choice to gather all the citizens within the walls, a choice that favors the spread of the disease. The plague is not only a historical juncture, but also reveals the moral decline of democracy. The passages in which Thucydides describes the effect of the disease on behavior are impressive because they reveal the progressive degradation of humanity. The men and women who had buried the fallen in the name of democracy, who had been consoled by Pericles and had admired the monuments on the Acropolis, these men and these women ceased to have calm, virtue, and dignity. They throw themselves into wells. They no longer remember their families. They lose their courage and bravery, and above all, their ability to feel part of community. The reduction of the space of humanity and of elementary rights, pity between relatives, hospitality, friendship, finds a significant echo precisely during the expedition to Sicily, in the grids of errors destined to drive Athens into ruin. After 2 years of war, the Athenian strategoi decided to abandon their camp at the gate of Syracuse. During the retreat, thousands of men were forced to forget their elementary duties towards dead and fellow soldiers in order to survive. Few returned from Sicily. Most of the men die in battle or are taken prisoners and slaves. The strategoi are executed. The defeat is great and final. Thucydides' announcement made immediately after the death of Pericles is fulfilled in 7th book. The plague first, and then 50 years later, the expedition to the island thus represent a turning point that marks the decline of the Athenian system. With 2 types of death, one in the city, the other far from the homeland, youth dies, and radical democracy and empire embraced begin to fall. Together they had grown, together they had developed, together they disintegrated. In the terrible decades from the defeat in Sicily to the defeat at the Bospotami, Athens lost everything, its allies, its fleet, and its walls, the 2 supports and symbols of Periclean democracy. It lost the possibility of financially nourishing radical democracy. The 2 oligarchic attempts in the last decade of the 5th century show the fragility of democracy left naked. It is deprived of the empire's revenue and the support of the ruling class. In its short life and in the times and ways of its fall, Athenian radical democracies poses many questions about the possibilities of doing a real and not just formal democracy, and about the complicated relation between democracy and hegemony. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. That was really wonderful. So there's already a question in the chat. I'll just, as you read that, I guess I will remind everyone that we're going to take questions by typing them in the chat. So please go ahead. And Stefania, do you want to keep monitoring that, and I'll monitor it as well and just let you know?
You can read them for all the people and read by myself. Yes.
Sure. Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
So the first question is, I wonder whether we should take as a context several things going on in the Mediterranean at the same time and shortly after. First is the struggle of those cities that succeeded Athens to build empires themselves. Second, the development of Macedonia to the north. Third, the efforts of Rome to unify Italy and their rule over it. This seems to show that Pericles rightly understood the need for larger political units. That the Athenians failed to construct that can be attributed to many things, from the plague to military limitations to inability to make association with Athens somehow equal or beneficial to the other cities. But the unification of Italy, we do not call the period of empire building of Rome. Despite the many atrocities that one cannot defend, the political trends would suggest that the survival of the democracy might have required the unification that Pericles undertook for Greece as a whole.
It's a very good question. So the problem probably is the internal fragmentation of political world. I agree with you. Pericles has had a dream, a sort of dream, to unification the Greek world. But at this time, it was impossible. The form of empire is not so, the problem, I think, is the form of equilibrium between the head and then the allies or the other who linked to Athens and to Pericles. The system that Pericles, or Ephialtes and Pericles and Cleon and so on had formed was a system too imperialistic. It's not really an unification, because the single elements disperse or have no an identity. It's the problem of Greek history. We know it. And the Macedonian and then the Roman Empire are more efficacious, more active. To me, the law of citizenship is really strange, because the unification of Greek world is not linked, is linked with the idea of the Athenians are better than the other. And the criterion was the birth. And so if you came from Syracuse or Taranto or Aegina or Sparta, it's impossible to you to find the benefits of democracy. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The idea of the protos, the protosaner and the protopolis, with the possibility to do really an unification. It's two ideas, it's not combined, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Here is another one. Athenian democracy did not depend on control of a naval empire, and the decline of democracy did not go along with the dissolution of the First and Second Naval Alliance. Please comment briefly on the thriving periods of democracy in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Was there a decline of democracy at all, or were the Democrats simply defeated by Antipater and later Antigonos Gonatas?
Well, we have talked not about Athenian democracy, but about radical democracy. Is just different. As Domenico Musti, the biggest Italian historian, have demonstrated, the word democratia was used in many occasions in 4th century, but it's not radical democracy. Because I think the radical democracy, what we intend to radical democracy is this idea of a political and social body that can benefit of the money of the empire. I think that Athenian democracy is not just Athenian democracy for century, but because Syracuse, Cyrene, all the cities in the Mediterranean area have a democracy, a sort of democracy. Just as the democracy that have a dialogue with the kings on the Hellenist age, as I know I think is not so much, but a bit different from radical democracy.
sorry, I don't have time. I guess since I'm speaking, is it okay if I just ask a very quick question just based on something that you just said, actually, because I just wonder what you think the purpose of the citizenship law was. As you were, because yeah, just as you were giving the answer to the first question, I just wondered what that means for you, you know, as a historian, like how do you interpret that law? Like what was it for? Was it, you know, just to sort of support your argument to make Athens sort of more distinct and then like a particular class of Athenians better than others? Or was there some practical reason, you know, as people argue about court cases and things like that?
I think both.
Okay.
Because, well, the problem is to close this political body. To close at the birth is the criterion more practical and definitive. Mother and father are really clear. Oh, just we have examples of we have the dokimasia, and then that means that the identity of the Athenians are really thought in the solid link with the earth, with Athens, with the Attica. So we have a symbolic level, the autochthony. The Athenians are are autochthony, other people are epelides. And then a practical, because I imagine Athens in the 5th century and the port in the 5th century, I wonder, it was people from the all Mediterranean areas. So I think is the both practical, symbolic, ideological reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting about your talk is just how what decline is depends on who is, you know, somebody's perception. So it just depends on whose perspective we're looking at to find, you know, what is decline and what is success. And I think some of the questions kind of suggest that too. It's interesting. Yeah, please go ahead.
But the perception, I used the point of view of Thucydides, because I am convinced that the union in the speech in the second book of Epitaph and Down of the Plague is not, so it's a rhetorical and is a message for the lecturer, for us, for the public.
Completely agree with you there. Yeah, completely agree. If anyone has any other questions, please type them in the chat box. Let me see whether people have hands raised, because I haven't been able to look at that.
Terrific answers to questions.
Yes. You can't answer that one. If there are no other questions, I think I will just turn things over to Giovanni. Wait for Giovanni to... Yes, there you are.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. And so I thank very much Stefania, whose answers were absolutely okay. And I think that...
Oh, it's not important. My English is so bad. I understand this.
Okay.
No.
And I have just to... I apologize for not having being here from the beginning, because I had some technical problems and I was late coming from the university. But I just have to announce the next appointment, the next date, that is on 11th October, that is a Monday. On 11 October will be with us Frédéric Hurlet, who is professor in Paris, Nanterre, who will talk about the decline of the political assemblies, not only of Rome, but also the public assemblies and popular participations in the cities of the Roman Empire. So I hope you are here, numbers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.